Most of us think we know the story of the Opium Wars. But what if that version, the one you probably read in a textbook somewhere, is just that, a story? Today, we're going to use the work of historian Hans Derks as our guide to look at how that story was written, and maybe more importantly, why. So let's pull back the curtain on the history we think we know.
This is the image that pops into your head, right? The opium wreck. And as historian Carl Trocki points out, this stereotype has been incredibly sticky. It's such a powerful image where somehow the victim ended up becoming the symbol for the crime itself.
So that's the big question we're digging into today. How on earth did that narrative get flipped so completely? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the official justification for the whole opium trade.
Right, so to understand how the story got twisted, we've got to start with the official excuse. And it all comes down to Britain's massive obsession with tea and a very convenient myth about a closed and totally unwilling China. So here's the classic line. The British were desperate for Chinese tea, but the Chinese, because they were supposedly self-sufficient, they didn't want any British goods in return. This created a huge trade imbalance. So the story goes, the British just had to find something the Chinese would actually buy. And that something was opium.
And this is where you see the connection. Clear as day. The source material puts it perfectly. As tea drinking rose in England, opium smoking rose in China. The profits from selling all that opium, which was grown in British-controlled India, were so insane they actually paid for the entire colonial government of British India. It was a disturbingly perfect and incredibly destructive cycle. But here's where Derks comes in and flips the whole thing on its head. He says this idea of a completely sealed-off, self-sufficient China was, well, a myth. He argues it was a story they cooked up to give them a political and economic excuse for what they really wanted to do, use military force to pry the country open for business.
Okay, so if the whole trade imbalance thing was just a cover story, what was really going on? What was the real engine driving this whole thing? According to Derks, it was something way more sinister. The creation of what he calls a narco-military empire.
And you really need to get this term, narco-military empire, because it is absolutely key. It means that the state's power and its profits from the drug trade were completely tied together, totally inseparable. Opium wasn't some side hustle for the British Empire, it was the financial bedrock that funded its colonial machine and its military expansion. And the fallout from the state-sponsored drug trade? I mean, it was absolutely catastrophic. We're talking widespread poverty, millions and millions of people addicted, fueling wars and creating systemic corruption on all sides. It created, as the source describes it, brutal perpetrators and helpless and even disgraced victims. So if the reality on the ground was that grim, how in the world did the popular story become so different? Well, that's where we get to that old saying, history is written by the victors. It's all about crafting a narrative that makes it all seem okay. And you see this narrative pop up everywhere, even in major historical atlases. Just listen to the words they're using here. The West presents a challenge. The Chinese are slow to realize that they've been overtaken. See how that works? It frames China as arrogant and backwards, and the British actions as just a necessary wake-up call. But Derks tells us we need to pump the brakes and question every single part of that story. Was it really a challenge, or was it a full-on military assault? Were those diplomatic missions genuine, or just arrogant demands to legalize their drug trade? And hey, didn't China have every right to ban a product that was devastating its own people? And here's another classic tactic you'll see in this kind of story. Downplay the actual damage. You'll find arguments, like this one from W. Bernstein, suggesting that opium was basically just a social drug and that only a tiny percentage of users were ever really harmed. A tiny percentage. Okay, but what does that actually look like in a country of 400 million people? Well, a tiny percentage, just 1%, is 4 million people. 4 million lives at risk, not to mention the countless families and communities just torn apart. Which brings us to the last piece of the puzzle. And honestly, it might be the most important one. With facts like these staring us in the face, how does that old, sanitized story still hang around? Well, Derks argues the answer isn't in what's said, but in what's left unsaid. So Derks argues that for a really long time, the main tactic in Western history wasn't to tell big lies. No, it was much simpler. Just don't talk about it. Treat the whole opium catastrophe like a tiny little footnote. It wasn't about creating falsehoods. It was about strategically ignoring a very uncomfortable truth. And he's not just making this up. He brings receipts. In the massive, multi-volume Oxford History of the British Empire, opium is barely even considered worth analyzing. In the famous economic histories by Fernand Braudel, there's not a single word about it. In major Dutch histories, if it gets mentioned at all, it's just in passing.
So why? Why the big hush-hush? It's not like there wasn't evidence. The records are all there. Derks' conclusion is that the history of the opium trade hits, in his words, an open sore in the conscience of the Western colonizers. It's a story of state-sponsored drug trafficking that is so ugly, so damning, that for a lot of people, it's just been easier to look away.
And that's where we'll leave it. If you reframe the Opium Wars, not as some clash of civilizations over free trade, but as the violent enforcement of a narco-military empire's business model, what does that change for us today? It forces us to rethink, well, everything. Not just the past, but how stories of power get told, who gets to write them, and which victims are still being made to stand for the crime.